She was my best friend's sister, calm, composed, and always a step ahead. Back then, she taught me how to pass my exams. Years later, she taught me something harder, how to feel again. It had been almost 10 years since I last walked through those narrow streets, the ones lined with yellow lamps that always seemed to hum in the quiet. My old town hadn't changed much, only softened. The same bakery on the corner still carried the smell of warm bread, and the bookstore across from it still had that faded blue awning that flapped lazily with the wind. I came back for reasons I didn't fully understand. Maybe I was tired of the noise I'd built my life around, the kind that never really lets you think. Or maybe I just missed a version of myself that existed here once, restless, naive, but still open to wonder. When I met my old friend Mark again, it was like no time had passed. We laughed about stupid things, about how I once tried to skip his sister's tutoring sessions by pretending to be sick. Still terrible at excuses, he said, grinning. His sister. Elena. The one person who never bought into my clumsy charm or lazy confidence. Mark mentioned she still lived here, that she'd become a literature tutor at the college. I remembered her as calm and untouchable, always reading under the old oak tree in their yard, surrounded by falling leaves and silence. Later that evening, I stopped by the small cafe near the park, the same one she used to visit after work. I didn't plan to see her. I told myself it was coincidence. But when I saw her sitting there by the window, the lie fell apart instantly. Elena hadn't changed much, not in the ways that mattered. Her hair was a little shorter, softer around her face, and a pair of reading glasses rested on the bridge of her nose. She was still dressed the same, simple, thoughtful, the kind of beauty that didn't need effort to be seen. I stood there for a second too long before she looked up. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, then softened into something warmer. That half-smile, I remembered it. It was the same one she used when I finally got an answer right after hours of her patient explanations. "You still remember how to read, right?" she said, tilting her head slightly, voice light and teasing. I laughed, maybe too quickly, because it felt easier than admitting how her voice still had that same quiet pull on me. We talked a while, small things at first. How life had gone, how we both drifted away from things that once defined us. She told me about her students, about the way teaching had changed her patience and sharpened her solitude. When she spoke, I found myself listening the way I never used to, not for answers, but for the spaces between her words. The pauses. The gentleness in her tone when she talked about meaning and loss. Outside, the sky was sliding into gold. Inside, the light from the window caught in her hair, turning each strand into something luminous. And as I watched her, older, calmer, somehow even more unreachable, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was recognition, of a warmth I thought I'd forgotten, sitting quietly across from me again after all this time. We met again a few days later. She said she had some papers to grade but didn't mind the company. I didn't either. Somehow, the cafe had become our quiet meeting ground, same table, same window, the same smell of roasted beans and soft jazz humming in the background. The first few minutes were casual, easy, the kind of rhythm you fall into when two people already share a past. We laughed about how impossible I used to be to teach. I reminded her how I'd once written a full essay on the wrong topic just to make her smile. "You did," she said, shaking her head, eyes glinting with amusement. "And I still gave you a passing grade because you argued it so confidently." "You were too kind," I said. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "No," she replied softly. "I just didn't want to see you give up." That sentence, simple, almost casual, stayed with me longer than I expected. It was the way she said it. Like she still meant it. Like a part of her had been keeping track of the version of me she once tried to fix. I admitted, half-jokingly, that maybe I had given up, not on grades, but on something else. On direction. On the idea that life was supposed to feel like more than just endurance. She didn't laugh. She leaned back slightly, crossing her legs, her gaze steady and unreadable. You always used to look for shortcuts, she said, but the truth is, you were never lazy. You were just, restless. Restless, I repeated, as if the word had a shape I could finally touch. She nodded. Maybe you just need a better teacher again. I raised an eyebrow, smiling. And what would you teach me this time? Her lips curved in a quiet, knowing smile, one that didn't give away much but somehow said everything. The fun way, she said, almost in a whisper. The way that makes you actually want to learn. I didn't ask what that meant. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Maybe I already knew. From that evening onward, it became an unspoken routine. She'd call or text, sometimes late, saying, "You still up for another lesson?" And I always was. Our lessons weren't about books anymore. She taught me through conversations, through long walks by the riverside, where she'd talk about how people carry stories they never finish. Through silent pauses where I learned that not every answer needs to be spoken. Through the way she listened, not to respond, but to understand. Sometimes, when the air turned cool and her hair brushed against her face, I'd catch myself watching her too long. There was a quiet confidence about her now, the kind that came from knowing herself completely, even when life hadn't been kind. "Stop overthinking," she'd say, tapping my notebook once with her pen. "Just feel what you mean." And I did. Not just the lessons, but her presence, the calm cadence of her voice, the way her hand would rest near mine as she leaned forward, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin. That was how it began, not with declarations or plans, but with the simplest thing of all, her offer to teach me again. Only this time, the lessons had nothing to do with passing. They had everything to do with living. Our lessons began to happen after dusk, when the streets were quieter, when everything felt softer and less guarded. She said the evenings helped her think clearer. For me, it was just easier to breathe around her when the world outside had already exhaled. Sometimes I'd bring takeout, other times, she'd brew jasmine tea that filled her small apartment with a calm, delicate scent. The space felt like her, warm, deliberate, surrounded by books and light that never glared too harshly. There were notes scattered across the coffee table, some half-written, others crossed out in frustration. She always laughed about how she never quite finished her thoughts. Those evenings didn't feel like tutoring sessions, they were something quieter, more intimate. She'd talk about novels and how the best ones didn't shout their meaning, they whispered it, asking you to lean closer to understand. I began to think she was describing herself without realizing it. When she explained something, she had this habit of using her hands, graceful, measured movements that somehow made every word feel more alive. Sometimes, when she emphasized a point, her fingertips would brush my arm lightly, unintentionally. It was such a small thing, but it sent warmth racing beneath my skin every time. I started noticing details I never had before, the faint freckle just below her jawline, the way her voice lowered when she read something she loved, or how she'd tuck her hair behind her ear with the same absent motion whenever she got lost in thought. One night, the rain began while we were reading. The drops tapped gently against the window, filling the pauses between our words. She smiled faintly, resting her chin on her hand. "You always learn better when it rains," she said. I looked at her, half amused. "Why's that?" "Because you listen more," she replied. "You stop rushing to the next thing." Her tone was soft, almost wistful, as if she was speaking to herself. I wanted to ask what she was thinking, but the silence between us felt too delicate to break. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth through the open window. The lamp cast a warm glow across her face, and for a moment, she looked like something out of one of those stories she loved, timeless, calm, but with eyes that carried storms of their own. We talked about everything that night, about how people lose themselves in their routines, about fear, about wanting more from life than just surviving it. Her honesty disarmed me. She didn't pretend to have everything figured out, and somehow, that made her seem stronger. At one point, I told her that her lessons were different now, that they felt less like teaching and more like connection. She looked at me for a long moment, her lips parting slightly, as if she was about to say something important. But instead, she just smiled. Maybe that's the point, she whispered. Sometimes what we learn has nothing to do with the subject. The rain eased, but neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, gentle, but alive. And though nothing was said, something had already shifted, quietly, invisibly, between teacher and student, between past and present, between what was safe and what was beginning to feel dangerously real. The evening I found her struggling with the window was the first time I saw her without the calm she wore so naturally. The wind had picked up, tossing her curtains like restless ghosts. Papers scattered across the floor, and she was kneeling to gather them when I knocked softly on the half-open door. "Come in," she said, not looking up. Her voice was tired, not the usual steady, grounded tone I'd grown used to. I helped her close the window, the latch resisted, then finally gave with a sharp click. When I turned, she was standing close, closer than before. Her hair was loose, falling around her shoulders, and her glasses rested on the table beside her. She exhaled, brushing a strand from her cheek. "It's been one of those days," she murmured. I asked if it was her students again, but she shook her head. Then, quietly, she told me about an offer she'd received, a teaching position abroad. A chance to start fresh. The way she said it made it sound more like a burden than a dream. "I should be excited," she said. "Everyone says I should be. But I keep wondering what I'd be leaving behind." She sat on the couch, motioning for me to join her. For a moment, the only sound was the rain pressing against the glass. I could see the weight behind her eyes, the fear of moving on, the fear of staying the same. "You've grown quiet," she said suddenly, turning toward me. "You never used to be." "I just don't know what to say," I admitted. "It sounds like you already know what you want." She gave a small laugh, low and fragile. "If only it were that simple." Her gaze lingered on me a second longer than it should have. "You make things feel less complicated, you know that?" I didn't know how to answer. My heart was thudding against my ribs, loud enough that I was sure she could hear it. When she leaned forward to grab a fallen paper, her hand brushed mine, a brief, unplanned touch. Neither of us moved away. Her fingers were warm, steady. I looked up, and our eyes met, not by accident, not anymore. Something silent passed between us, something we'd both been pretending not to feel. Her breath caught, I saw it in the way her chest rose slightly, in the faint tremor of her lips. Then thunder cracked in the distance, breaking the spell. She withdrew her hand gently, clearing her throat. "Let's get back to the lesson," she said, her voice quieter now, uncertain. But the book lay forgotten on the table. Neither of us reached for it. Instead, we sat there, pretending to focus on the words printed on the page, both aware that something had shifted, small, irreversible. When I finally left that night, the rain had stopped, but the air outside still carried its scent. I stood on her porch for a moment, staring at the faint light spilling from her window. I'd gone there to learn again, but what she was teaching me now wasn't in any book. It was the ache of wanting something you're not sure you're allowed to touch. After that night, something unspoken settled between us, not awkwardness exactly, but an awareness that neither of us could ignore anymore. Our conversations changed. They became slower, more deliberate. Words carried weight. Pauses stretched longer. Even silence seemed to mean something. We still met for our lessons, though they had long since stopped being about literature. Some evenings, we walked by the river. She liked that path, quiet, lined with old trees that leaned close like they were listening. The air always smelled faintly of damp grass and distance. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the water, she asked, "Do you ever think about who you've become?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes I think I'm still catching up to the version of me I was supposed to be." She smiled softly. That's more honest than most people admit. When she said things like that, I could feel them settle inside me, reshaping something I didn't realize needed changing. I turned to her. You know, I still remember how patient you were back then. Everyone else thought I'd give up, but you just refused to. Her expression shifted, not pride, but something quieter, sadder. I wasn't patient, she said. I was scared. Of what? That you'd believe them, she said, her voice barely above the sound of the wind. That you'd start thinking you weren't enough. I used to see so much light in you. I didn't want to be the one who let it fade. The honesty in her tone caught me off guard. I could see her trying to look away, but I didn't let her. My voice came out low, steady. You didn't let it fade. You were the only one who made me believe it was still there. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The night hummed softly around us, the ripple of the river, the faint murmur of leaves. Her hand was resting on the bench between us, and without really thinking, I reached for it. I didn't grab it. I just covered it gently with mine. Her fingers tensed slightly, then relaxed. She turned her head, eyes searching mine, and in that look, I saw everything, the years we'd missed, the words we hadn't said, the weight of what it meant to feel something again when you weren't supposed to. I was always harder on you, she whispered, because you reminded me of the part of myself that still wanted to hope. I could feel the air tighten around us. The truth in her voice was raw, beautiful, and it hurt in the most human way. I squeezed her hand lightly. Then maybe I can remind you again. Her breath caught, a soft, fragile sound. She didn't pull away. For the first time since I'd known her, Elena didn't have anything left to teach. We sat there with nothing but the truth between us, two people who had spent years learning how to hide what they felt, finally running out of reasons to. And under the quiet sky, with the river moving like time itself, I realized that whatever this was, whatever we had just confessed, wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing either of us had ever done. She told me about the job over tea, as if it were a small thing. A single sentence dropped gently into the quiet, I've decided to take it. Her voice was calm, but her fingers betrayed her, tracing the rim of her cup again and again. The decision was made, yet her eyes flickered with something that didn't look like certainty. I tried to smile, to sound supportive. That's incredible, Elena. You deserve it. She looked at me then, really looked. You think so? I nodded, but the motion felt mechanical. Inside, something twisted. I wanted to tell her not to go, but the words sat heavy in my throat. What right did I have? I was never part of her plans, just a chapter she'd helped edit. That night, she invited me over for dinner, a quiet, private goodbye. Her apartment was dimly lit, the golden glow of two small lamps giving everything a kind of softness. A half-finished bottle of wine stood on the table, and the record player hummed an old jazz tune we both recognized. She cooked, though she barely ate. We talked like we always did, but every laugh felt a little delayed, every glance a little longer than it should have been. It wasn't awkward, just painfully gentle, like two people trying to memorize the moment before it disappeared. When she finally sat beside me on the couch, I could smell her perfume, faint and familiar, like rain on old pages. She leaned back, her shoulder brushing mine. The warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing, it all felt fragile, like a dream I was afraid to wake from. I didn't think it would be this hard, she said quietly. Leaving, I mean. You've done it before, I reminded her. You're good at new beginnings. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. I used to be. For a while, we just sat there, not talking. The music filled the spaces between our thoughts. Then she turned to me, slow, hesitant. Thank you, she said. For what? For listening. For seeing me. I wanted to say don't thank me, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I just looked at her, the woman who had once been my tutor, my quiet anchor, my unexpected lesson in everything that mattered. When she walked me to the door, I knew this was the moment. The one where people in stories say all the things they've been holding back. But in real life, sometimes you just stand there, trying not to break. She reached up first, brushing her fingers against my cheek. The touch was tender, deliberate. "You really did learn," she whispered. My chest tightened. I caught her hand, pressing it lightly to my lips. "You taught me more than you know." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled, a small, steady smile. Then maybe I did something right. And for a second, it felt like goodbye. But when I walked out into the night, the cool air on my face, the echo of her touch still on my skin, I realized it wasn't. It couldn't be. Some lessons don't end when the teacher leaves. They stay, quietly, endlessly, until the heart decides to learn them again. It had been 8 months since she left. Enough time for the seasons to shift, for routines to form and fade again. Enough time for her absence to stop feeling sharp, and start feeling like part of the air I breathed. Life didn't exactly go back to normal. It just steadied. I went back to work, reconnected with people I'd neglected, but something about me had changed. Elena had once said that good teachers don't just fill your mind, they change how you see. And she had. In ways that were quiet, permanent, and impossible to undo. I found myself reading again, writing again. I even started volunteering at a local youth center, helping a few kids who'd fallen behind in school. It wasn't much, but it felt right. Sometimes, when I explained a concept or told them not to give up, I'd catch myself echoing her exact words, her calm tone, her small, patient pauses. It made me smile every time. Then one late afternoon, I walked into that same cafe, the one by the park, and there she was. Sitting by the window, a book open, sunlight catching the edge of her hair. For a heartbeat, I thought I was imagining her. She looked the same and somehow different, more centered, maybe. The kind of peace that comes after choosing something for yourself, even if it cost you. When she saw me, surprise flickered across her face, followed by a slow, genuine smile. The kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the lips. "You're still here," she said softly, as if the thought itself carried relief. "I was beginning to think you forgot this place," I replied, trying to sound casual. But inside, everything in me was humming with quiet disbelief. We talked for hours, just like before, about her time abroad, the students she'd taught, the new language she was learning. She laughed more easily now, and when she spoke, her voice carried something lighter. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You seem different." I smiled. Maybe I finally started paying attention in class. Her laughter, low, warm, familiar, filled the space between us. She reached across the table, resting her hand over mine in a gesture so natural it didn't even feel like a risk anymore. "So," she said, eyes glinting, "you're the tutor now." "Guess I learned from the best," I said. We fell into a comfortable silence after that. The kind that doesn't need filling. Outside, the light was fading, and the cafe's lamps began to glow, that same golden hue I remembered from the first evening I'd seen her again. I realized then that whatever existed between us no longer needed naming or defining. It wasn't about lessons or goodbyes anymore. It was about two people who had found their way back, not because they were waiting, but because they'd both grown into the kind of people who could finally meet as equals. When we stood to leave, she looked at me and said, "You always did listen better when it rained." And just as we stepped outside, a few soft drops began to fall, like the story itself was coming full circle, quietly, without fanfare. We didn't run for cover this time. We just walked, side by side, through the gentle rain, not teacher and student anymore, not past and present, just two hearts that had finally learned, in their own time, how to stay. If you've ever had someone who changed the way you see yourself, someone who quietly became your greatest lesson, tell me in the comments what that one person taught you. And if you felt the ache and warmth of this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves slow burn, emotional storytelling as much as you do. There's more coming, more stories of love that takes its time, hearts that find their way back, and connections that never really end. Sparkle, subscribe now and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this series of age gap, soul deep romances.